Kaserne, vor dem großen Tor, steht eine Laterne und steckt sie.
Welcome to the 25th episode of Always Remember, World War II Through Veterans' Eyes. Edgar Kuhlow, he didn't stay laying in Germany. Sick with malaria, on a 150 to 200 mile 3-week forced march from one German POW camp to another, Edgar Kuhlow heard one German guard talking about him to another guard. Da blibt he in Deutschland liegen. He is going to stay laying here in Germany. Having already survived brutal combat at Anzio and in southern France, as well as 7 months of incarceration as a POW, Edgar Kuhlow was determined to survive and to prove the German guard wrong. This podcast tells Edgar Kuhlow's harrowing story. During the 1990s, while serving as a teacher with the Department of Defense schools in Bad Kreuznach, Germany, my family and I visited many of the sites associated with World War II, from the beaches of Normandy, where the D-Day landings took place, to the Ardennes forest, where the Battle of the Bulge was fought, to the death camps of Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Dachau. We saw what was at stake in World War II, when not only democracy in the U.S., but throughout the world hung in the balance. I began to write to World War II veterans to thank them for their service. I sent them pictures of the sites we visited. I invited them to share their stories with me, and I promised to keep them alive in the classes that I taught. What I never could have anticipated was that veterans shared their stories with their buddies and printed my letters in the reunion newsletters. I was soon corresponding with approximately 140 World War II veterans, 20 of whom received the nation's highest honor, the Medal of Honor. I had more material than I could ever use in the classes I taught, so to keep my promise, I wrote Always Remember, World War II Through Veterans' Eyes, and launched this series of podcasts, which are based upon the book. At the age of 24, Edgar L. Kuhlow of Sheboygan Falls, Wisconsin, was inducted into the Army on November 20th, 1942. Kuhlow was first sent to Fort Sheridan in Illinois for processing, before he was shipped to Camp Phillips, Kansas, for basic training. Camp Phillips had just opened, and Kuhlow's group was the first to arrive. Kuhlow was assigned to the 94th Infantry Division as a rifleman. For most of the young GIs, Christmas 1942 was their first Christmas away from home. Volunteer families in the small town about 20 miles from Camp Phillips invited soldiers to spend Christmas with them. Kuhlow signed up for this. Kuhlow recalled that the GIs were brought to the town's school gym at about 10 a.m. "We all lined up in the gym, and the people picked out the soldiers they wanted. Another soldier and myself were picked up by a widow lady and her 17-year-old daughter. They showed us the town. They took us home for dinner, and they entertained us in the afternoon. In the evening, they took us back to the gym, where they had a dance for the whole group. My dancing didn't go too well, with the big heavy GI boots, but we had a lot of fun. At about 11 o'clock, we left in our trucks back to the camp. What a wonderful day." It was a good thing the soldiers had such a great Christmas, because basic training was tough. Kuhlow remembered one particularly challenging march. "The furthest I ever walked in one day was also here at Camp Phillips, on a hike, full field pack, and carrying our 9-pound M1 rifle. We started out before daylight, and we got to our area about 14 hours later, 27 miles. I don't ever want to do that again." In September 1943, the 94th Infantry Division was shipped out by troop train from Kansas to Tennessee for more maneuvers. The recruits were on the train for 2 days. Once they arrived, the recruits were told to put up pinch tents. They were going to be living outside. "I never felt so depressed in my life. It seemed like the end of the world. No more barracks or mess hall or bathroom. Little did I realize that this was going to be mild against what was yet to come." Maneuvers were held to simulate actual combat with the recruits assigned to either the Red or Blue forces. It wasn't long before the 94th received a call to provide replacements for the infantry divisions already fighting in Italy. Sicily had already fallen into Allied hands, and the fighting was now in Italy, and it was going very slowly. The replacements were chosen by lot. Kuhlow was one of those selected and was soon sent to Fort Meade, Maryland, for processing. Before long, Kuhlow was on a Liberty ship in a large blacked-out convoy zigzagging across the Atlantic. They arrived in Casablanca, Morocco, on November 21st, 1943. Kuhlow wasn't much impressed with Casablanca. The waterfront at Casablanca was very modern, but when you got back into town, it was dirty and very primitive. We were each issued a rifle and ammo. You did not walk around town alone, and you always carried your rifle. Some Arab could stab you in the back just to steal your shoes. But the food was a serious upgrade, prepared as it was by Italian POWs. Thanksgiving 1943 found Kuhlow on a boxcar train headed for Oran, Algeria, eating cold sea rations. At the army base in Oran, the GIs were housed in 8-man tents. Kuhlow attended an engineering school, studying mine warfare and demolitions. His buddies were soon shipped out to different units. Shortly after Christmas 1943, Kuhlow himself was sent to Naples. The harbor was full of sunken ships, and the city was in ruins. Edgar Kuhlow was assigned as a rifleman replacement with the C Company, 180th Infantry Regiment of the 45th Infantry Division, which had been an Oklahoma National Guard division. As such, the 45th had a number of soldiers of Native American heritage, primarily Apache. From Naples, the Thunderbirds, as the 45th were called, boarded LST landing crafts and were sent to Anzio, just a day or two after the January 22, 1944 invasion. Edgar Kuhlow was now in combat. Kuhlow described Anzio as a complete stalemate. We were positioned in these foxholes facing the Germans. The only time we could leave our foxholes was after dark to bring up water, rations, K-rations, and ammunition. If you got out of your foxhole in daylight, or even as much as stuck your head out, you got shot at. We were subject to constant shelling by German artillery. Because the Germans held the high ground throughout much of the Battle of Anzio, the Americans were pinned 2 men to a foxhole. The stalemate gave them plenty of time to make their foxholes ever more elaborate, and many GIs covered them with boards they obtained at night from nearby abandoned farmhouses, giving them an extra layer of protection. The Americans were subjected to near constant German artillery shelling, but feared Anzio Annie, mounted on a railroad car and kept in a railroad tunnel when not in use, the most. Kuhlow recalled, Anzio Annie could shoot a distance of about 20 miles. It had a demoralizing whine to it, and you could hear the shells coming for miles. Kuhlow found that he did a lot of praying. I don't think you found many atheists in these foxholes. For Kuhlow, not knowing what was going on at Anzio was almost as bad as the fighting itself. We were told nothing. Our mail was censored, and we were kept completely in the dark. Kuhlow had no idea of how bad the Battle of Anzio, which went on for months, was going. As with most soldiers, Kuhlow's only reality was his own little sector. That was it. Gone were the friends that Kuhlow had made in basic training. He found it was useless to try to make friends in combat. You would only lose them. This happened to me quite often. All of a sudden, you'd find yourself all alone again, where you don't know anyone. The stalemate at Anzio was finally broken sometime in May, and the 45th was sent north to liberate Rome, which fell on June 4th. Rome was spared from much damage because the Germans pulled out and it was declared an open city. I spent one whole day in Rome sightseeing. After the 45th liberated Paris, they received some much-needed rest in southern Italy. What was heartbreaking was the plight of the people. At chow time, the children, barefoot and dressed in rags, would line up with their number 10 cans with the wire attached to the open top. When we were done eating, we would scrape what we had left in our mess kits into the cans. We always made sure we had a little left. They also took all that was left from the kitchen. There were no leftovers. These were not only children, but also older men and women, but mostly children. The ravages and devastation of war. The Thunderbirds were called back into action in August 1944 when they invaded Toulon in southern France. I was in the first wave. Our landing craft hit the beach in the early morning hours of August 15th, 1944. Our position on the first day was light, but then it picked up. We pushed north through Grenoble. Sometimes we rode in the trucks, sometimes we rode in the tranks, but for most of the part, we just walked. That's why we are called foot soldiers. As they worked their way through the beautiful French Alps, opposition became stronger, the fighting more intense, the closer they got to Germany. After a day of particularly heavy fighting, Kuhlow and his squad settled in their designated area for the night. They were given the order to clean their weapons, so they sat in a small circle, cleaning their weapons and discussing the events of the day. Our point man, Scout, was carrying a Tommy gun. As he was putting the magazine back, the gun fired, and a small bullet hit our barman, who was just sitting just opposite, right in the head. He was dead instantly. He was a big man, as that is what it took to carry the Browning automatic rifle, which is quite heavy. I jumped over to him, and I was trying to keep his brains from oozing out of his skull with my fingers. I called for the medic, who sprinkled on some sulfur powder. Thinking about it now, it seems kind of ridiculous what I was doing, trying to keep the man's brains in his head with my fingers. But you just couldn't sit there. You had to do something. It was bad enough to lose a man from enemy action, but friendly fire was even worse. On September 28, 1944, Kuhlow led a 6-man reconnaissance patrol near Epinal, France. The patrol was all that was left of our squad after 7 days of hard fighting. Their objective was to locate, but not engage, the Germans and report back to their company on their location. Unfortunately, the reconnaissance patrol succeeded only too well at finding the Germans and soon became surrounded by them. Upon being captured, the Germans lined the 6 American GIs up in a row. Kuhlow was convinced they were going to be shot. Instead, he found the German frontline soldiers treated their American POWs very well. They knew that tomorrow the situation could be reversed, Kuhlow said in a 1999 interview. Now behind the German lines, Kuhlow concluded there was no way the Germans could win the war. Their supply lines were hardly 1/3 of what ours were. They were even using some horses. For the next 7 months, until the end of the war, Kuhlow found himself a prisoner of war. Kuhlow's squad of 6 stayed together in the beginning. They were first sent to a camp at Strasbourg, France, which served as a sort of reception center for the POWs. Each man was assigned a number. They were there from October 8th to October 30th, 1944. From Strasbourg, they were then put on a train for Limburg, Germany, about 140 miles north of Strasbourg. We were on this train for over 2 days without any food. Arriving at Limburg, Germany, at the 12A Limburg-Hesse-Nassau Stalag on the Lahn River, the camp was very crowded with POWs. I guess the Germans never anticipated taking as many prisoners as they did. Kuhlow and his squad were housed in a circus tent with about 6 inches of straw on the ground. We were packed in like sardines, with just narrow aisles between the rows. Great thing. This way we kept warm. If you had to get out to go to the latrine, you had to be very careful so you won't step on someone and get your head bit off. There are no lights, so we were in when it got dark, and we stayed put until there was light again. Food was scarce and consisted of coffee for breakfast, thin soup for dinner, and 1/6 of a loaf of black bread for supper. On such a meager diet, all of the men began shedding pounds. POWs were also interrogated regularly, though Kuhlow was not bothered very much. They knew that a PFC in the infantry, private first class, doesn't know anything. They must have thought that a few of the men knew something. They were being called in all the time. American GIs were told to only give their name, rank, and serial number if captured. Eventually, when it got cold, the Germans moved the POWs into a brick building. There was no heat, but at least we had lights and an indoor latrine. The POWs slept on the brick floor, 3 men to a blanket. All 3 of us had to turn over at the same time, which was quite often, or you were out from under the blanket. At night, until the lights went out, the POWs would lay under the blanket and talk. For the young men, mostly in their 20s, a few still teenagers, you would have thought that the topics would have been girls, cars, or sports, but instead it was food. The POWs never had enough food. I'm only a little guy. I weigh 140 pounds, which is what I weighed when I was captured. By the time I was liberated, I was down to about 90 pounds. The meals got even worse as the war progressed, but Kuhlow did not necessarily blame the Germans. The German civilians were hurting almost as bad as we were. There was so little food, Kuhlow said in an interview. In their late-night conversations, POWs would talk about the food they would cook if they could. One man said if he ever got home again, he was going to have 2 refrigerators, and they were always going to be full. The POWs never said when they got home. It was always if they got home. It seemed like the POWs never had enough of anything, be it heat, water, soap, and especially food. One thing, though, that we had plenty of was lice and fleas. The bunks were full of them. Kuhlow didn't mind the lice as much as the fleas. Every so often, the Germans deloused the POWs. However, Kuhlow felt he could never get rid of the fleas. The minute you laid down, you could feel the fleas crawl up your legs, and then all over they went. You just couldn't stop them at all. While at the Limburg Stalag II A, Kuhlow was allowed to fill out a postcard to send home to his parents. My folks were much relieved to get the card, as the only thing they had heard from or about me since somewhere in September was the telegram from the War Department listing me as missing in action. It was the only time Kuhlow was allowed to send a letter home, nor did he ever receive any during his entire incarceration. On November 25th, 1944, Kuhlow and the rest of his squad of 6 POWs were sent by train to another POW camp in Hammerstein, Germany. If someone was to ask me, what was your worst experience as a POW, I would have to say it was a train trip from Limburg to Hammerstein. The men were all crammed into a boxcar that was so crowded that they couldn't all sit down at the same time. They had to take turns. We were on this train for 4 days and 4 nights, with very little food and water. Our toilet was a 10-gallon open tin can that always slopped over. It was so cold, by the time they arrived, a number of the men had frostbitten feet. Kuhlow was one of them. At Hammerstein Stalag XII B, the POWs received their first Red Cross parcels. 2 men were given 1 Red Cross parcel per a week. The parcels contained coffee, jam, margarine, peanut butter, powdered milk, chocolate, cigarettes, biscuits, Spam, and several other items. There were some French POWs who worked at a bakery near the Hammerstein Stalag. They sometimes brought in bread to trade. Kuhlow recalled one POW trading a $50 watch for a loaf of bread. "You couldn't eat the watch," the POW had said. Since Kuhlow didn't smoke, he would trade his cigarettes for more food whenever possible. "I don't remember ever having eaten any cake that tasted as good as that bread did." Kuhlow did receive treatment at the clinic for his frostbitten feet. Kuhlow was thankful that was all that he was suffering from. Dysentery was a constant problem for the POWs. In their weakened states, dysentery could be a death sentence for any POW unlucky enough to come down with it. "One day you would see them, skin and bones, sitting on the can most of the day. Then the next day you wouldn't see them anymore." The American POWs fared much better than their Russian counterparts, who also had a compound at Hammerstein. "The Soviet Union never signed the Geneva Convention pertaining to the treatment of prisoners of war. They received no Red Cross parcels. They were used for slave labor. Besides, the Germans really hated the Russians." Escape was almost out of the question. After a while, the GIs were so weak from malnourishment that they lacked the energy to make an attempt. The POWs also knew that for every 2 guys who escaped, 10 prisoners who stayed behind would be shot. "That was a powerful deterrent," Kuhlow explained. On January 6, 1945, Kuhlow was selected as one of a group of POWs sent about 100 miles southwest of Hammerstein to another stalag at Stargard, now a part of Poland. "We were to clean up and ready a hospital camp for some of the American prisoners from the Battle of the Bulge. None of my original squad was in this group. Now I was all alone again. I never heard from or about any of the rest ever again." Kuhlow described the hospital camp as makeshift and very poorly equipped. Part of the problem was the Germans never anticipated taking as many prisoners as they did, and they just couldn't handle them, as at this stage of the war their resources were almost exhausted. Kuhlow remembered the wounded and disabled POWs who arrived at the Battle of the Bulge. "Sure were a beat-up bunch." The weekly Red Cross parcels stopped at Stargard. Kuhlow would only see a couple more Red Cross parcels for the rest of his captivity. It was now back to just soup and black bread. As a German American, Kuhlow was able to stay informed on the progress of the war by listening to the German guards, who did not know that Kuhlow was proficient in their language. The new POWs who arrived to the camp were also an important source for news. Kuhlow stayed at Stargard for less than a month. On January 22, 1945, he was one of 12 men, all from Hammerstein, who were moved to a large farm for labor detail. Eventually, Kuhlow and other prisoners were sent to a large farm near Coburg, Germany, for labor detail. The POWs thrashed the grain bundles from the previous spring using a thrashing machine powered by a large electric motor. After the grain was baled, the POWs hauled it to the granary and brought straw to a cattle barn. Afternoons were spent chopping wood from the surrounding forest. "There were enough of us so we did not have to work overly hard." The POWs received slightly better rations because they were working. They also learned to carry their 10 cups to the dairy barn where they could get fresh milk from the cows. After a couple of weeks on the farm, Kuhlow started to experience intermittent attacks of chills, fever, and sweating. "While the rest were out during the day, I borrowed more blankets. No matter how many blankets I covered with, though, I could not get warm." One day the farmer went to town with his wagon. Kuhlow and a guard went with him to see a doctor. Kuhlow was diagnosed with malaria, which he had probably picked up in North Africa. However, the doctor didn't have any medicine he could give him. They returned to the farm. By the middle of February 1945, it was clear that the Russians were becoming close.
You could hear the big guns in the east. The guards were getting nervous.
With the Russians closing in on the Eastern Front, on February 15th, the Germans took Kuhlow and his fellow prisoners on a 3-week forced march.
The Germans did not want to give up any of the POWs. I think they especially wanted to use them for a bargaining chip with the Western Front allies. But of course, the allies demanded unconditional surrender, so this did not help them any.
Although the pace of the march was slow, since most of the German guards were old or disabled, it was still too much for Kuhlow, who was weakened with malaria. Kuhlow was allowed to ride in a wagon with other sick and disabled prisoners. Their column soon grew as other groups from other farms joined them on their march northwest following the Baltic Sea coastline. While on the wagon, Kuhlow overheard 2 guards talking about his weakened condition.
One said to the other, "Da blibt he in Deutschland liegen." He is going to stay laying here in Germany.
Fortunately, Kuhlow proved them wrong. He survived the 3-week, 150 to 200-mile trip and arrived on March 8th at Greifswald to a Belgium-French POW camp. Kuhlow and the other sick POWs were dropped off there while the rest of the column continued. Kuhlow remained there for nearly 2 months. He was placed in a medical barracks where a Belgian medic took very good care of the 12 sick and injured POWs. The medic even cooked for the little group on a coal and wood stove. The German guards gave the medic the rations he used to prepare the food. These included a few Red Cross parcels, too.
They called me Peanut Butter because I liked the peanut butter that was in the Red Cross parcel. They said they never heard of peanut butter until they got the Red Cross parcels.
The German guards became more generous with their food.
I think the Germans put in a little extra because we were sick and run down, and they were losing the war, and they wanted to make a good impression.
Kuhlow was given pills and injections for his malaria, and he slowly recovered, even gaining a few pounds.
For the most part, the Germans left us alone as long as we behaved ourselves. President Roosevelt died on April 12th. Then they came to the barracks right away to let us know. Now they had won the war, or so they thought.
By the end of April, the POWs were moved yet again so as to evade the fast-advancing Russian army. Kuhlow had regained his strength and was able to march the 30 miles to Stalag II at Barth, Germany, on the northern coast near the Baltic Sea. Kuhlow recalled the end of his captivity.
I arrived at Stalag II on May 1st, 1945. The next morning, May 2nd, the guards that brought us, plus all the camp guards, were gone. They pulled out during the night and they headed west to surrender to the Americans. The Russians arrived on May 3rd. May 7th, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally, and the war was over. On May 12th, our Air Force came in and flew us out. Our plane load, all sick and disabled, were flown to the 242nd General Hospital at Reims, France.
Kuhlow had been a prisoner of war for a little over 7 months. He was flown to Reims, France, where he was treated for 2 weeks in the 242nd General Hospital for malaria and anemia. His condition improved. Kuhlow was released, and a few short weeks later found himself headed home aboard the same Liberty ship that he had taken to North Africa. On the evening of June 30th, Kuhlow's troop ship docked at Hampton, Newport News, Virginia, the same port that he had embarked from.
As we came down the gangplank, the band played. There were banners everywhere. All the townspeople were out to greet us. I don't think there was a dry eye among us. I'm only a little guy, but I felt 10 feet tall coming down that gangplank. I don't remember if I kissed the ground or not. If I didn't, I certainly should have.
Kuhlow was given a 60-day furlough, and he wasted no time getting back to Sheboygan, Wisconsin, and to the home of his fiancée, Ruth, who lived with her folks.
To put it mildly, I was just a little nervous. It had been over 2 years. They lived upstairs above her grandparents. You opened the door below and you went up the stairs. Ruth's sister, Caroline, looked down the stairs to see who was coming up. She called to Ruth, "You better sit down."
Within a month, on July 28th, Edgar and Ruth were married. Edgar and Ruth were married for 52 years until her death in 1997. They owned and operated a farm in Sheboygan for 20 years, and they raised 2 boys. Edgar also worked as a rural mail carrier for the U.S. Post Office for 25 years until his retirement.
Lili Marleen, wie einst Lili Marleen.
Our song today, Lili Marleen, most popularly recorded by Marlene Dietrich, was Edgar Kuhlow's favorite World War II song.
When I got behind the German lines as a prisoner of war, the Germans were also playing and singing this song.
Lili Marleen was originally written by Hans Lieb, a German soldier on his way to the Russian front in 1915. According to Kuhlow,
Lieb said he was stationed in Berlin with the German army in 1914 and had 2 girlfriends, Lili and Marlene. Lili was the daughter of a Berlin businessman, and Marlene an army nurse. Standing guard one night under a lamppost, the first 3 verses came to the author, but he failed to finish it until 1937.
If you liked this podcast of Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes, please leave us a review on whatever podcast network you use. Follow our podcasts and tell your friends. New episodes come out bi-weekly. You can find the companion book on Amazon.com. Until next time, thank you for remembering our World War II veterans.